Wednesday. It's Wednesday. For your month's most. Yes.
Wow, it's for Wednesday.
It's Wednesday.
So now I know. Will we get any information?
I believe there's an all congregational email going out on Tuesday.
I see.
It's really for the kids, but.
Good morning. I am so pleased that we have Lauren Fox here with us today for this morning Sunday seminar. She's the author of Send For Me, which if you haven't had the chance to read yet, we are so fortunate that the bookstall is with us today. They are selling her book, and you will have a chance to get it autographed by Lauren. I'm going to give a very brief introduction, and then I will be turning it over to Lauren and Lori. Lauren Fox earned her MFA at the University of Minnesota. She's the author of the novels Days of Awe, Still Life with Husband, and Friends Like Us. Her writing has appeared in numerous publications, including the New York Times, Marie Claire, Parenting, Psychology Today, The Rumpus, and Salon. And she currently lives in Milwaukee with her husband and 2 daughters. So I am going to welcome her on up here, and if you can join me in welcoming Lauren Fox.
Thank you so much. It's really nice to be here. I feel like we should be sitting at a little table somewhere, though. It's very. That pretty much summed it up, and I'm really happy to be here. And Lori and I are going to do a Q&A, so maybe without further ado, I'll just invite Lori to come up and we can start chatting, and I'm happy to take any questions that you all have as well.
Good morning. It's
Hi.
so nice to have you back here.
Thank you.
So I thought we'd begin by this is your 4th novel?
Yeah.
Okay, so what inspired you to write this novel, which has such roots in Milwaukee? I also want to know, how did it feel to get chosen as a Jenna's Book Club selection?
Oh, no. So since it's such a small audience, and no pressure, but can I ask if people have read it or not? Because I'll give away all kinds of spoilers if most of you have read. Okay, well that looks like about half. So, my grandparents and mom are from Germany. Well, my grandparents passed away some years ago, but my mom was born in Germany and emigrated.
If you don't mind, you can take your mask off.
Or
you wanna keep it up?
At this
Okay.
point, I'm more comfortable taking my shirt off than taking this thing off. So I'm not gonna do either.
We need to project that.
I'm not gonna take my shirt off. So, so anyway, I don't know how to bounce back from that. So they came from Germany, and I knew, of course, that was their history, but they never really talked about it. They left in 1938. My grandmother's parents stayed behind, and I know that they had tried to get them out and were ultimately unsuccessful. Like many immigrants with this experience, they really didn't talk about it. So much of what I knew, the details I could count on one hand, the little things that my grandpa said to me or that my grandma mentioned. But other than that, it was a lot of silences and so much love. They were such loving, dear people. But I think they just wanted to protect us, protect my brother and me from this really hard history. So I grew up in Fox Point, which I don't know if you're familiar with Milwaukee. My grandparents lived in Shorewood, so 10 minutes away. We saw them all the time. When the last few years of their lives, they lived with us, and the contents of their apartment ended up in my parents' basement. So I was in graduate school at the University of Minnesota studying creative writing, and I was home visiting, and I was just going through my grandparents' stuff in our basement, and I stumbled on, I really just stumbled on this little box, this little wooden box of letters. I still remember this moment. I'm not a spiritual person, but I remember feeling this magic of knowing that these letters were something, and really not knowing what they were. They were on onion skin paper. There were about 75 of them wrapped in a pink bow, written in a German script that was illegible to me. My mom's first language is German, and she couldn't make heads or tails of them either. They were written in an old-fashioned German script that I think was taught until 1918, so not very many people can read it. And then maybe briefly taught again during the Nazi regime. I took the letters, with my mom's blessing, I took the letters back to Minneapolis with me, and I tried to get them translated, and I connected with a professor at the university who, I called the university's German department, and I thought they would just hook me up with someone. I still say hook me up in the way that old people say hook me up. I thought they would connect me with someone. And so this professor, his name was Gerhard Weiss. He was, his father was Jewish and his mother wasn't, and he grew up in Berlin and passed as a non-Jew, and he grew up in Berlin and passed as a non-Jew, and that's how he survived the war, just living in Berlin. So he kind of took me under his wing, and I would bring these letters to him. We had an appointment once a week, and I would bring a couple letters to him every week, and my little tape recorder. This is like pre-cell phone. And he would read them out loud, like translate them as he was reading them into my tape recorder, and I would take them home and transcribe them. So it was this like year-long process of like getting to know my family. And as I've said this before, but my great-grandmother wasn't really trying to tell a story. She was trying to get out of Germany. Her letters were full of longing and despair and sometimes anger. She was annoyed. She was like, why haven't we heard from you? She was desperate and sad. And this feeling accumulated throughout the process of 75 letters. And so I knew that I had something, and I was like I said, I was in creative writing graduate school at the time, and I felt like this was probably going to be a part of something I was working on. And I tried to write a memoir, but I was 25, sort of I hadn't lived enough to write a memoir. So it was kind of an unsuccessful, like, half project. And when I graduated, I abandoned it for a long time. This is a long answer to what inspired you to write this novel, but I put the project away for a really long time. We moved to Milwaukee. I had a couple kids. It makes it sound like it was just like boom, boom, boom. Like had a couple babies and, wrote a couple novels. And then in about 2016, I thought, well, I returned to the project for a number of reasons, one of which was the election of Trump and what we called the Muslim ban. It has a more specific name, but it was just sort of this like moment for me when I thought, we really haven't learned from our history. And it just inspired me to go back to this project and to see what I could do with it. As someone who had like 3 novels under my belt, I thought, and it actually took some convincing to get me to understand that I could turn this into a novel, that I could still remain true to the project and true to my great-grandmother's story and my story, but write it as historical fiction. So that is the Reader's Digest version of how I came to write Send For Me. And I wove the letters through the novel, as you may or may not know. And so the story is fictionalized, but every word of the letters is true.
Was your mom about the same age as Ruby was when?
Yep, she was about 2 when she came. She was born in 1936, and they came in 1938. And so she has no memories of it. And so but I feel like I'm I don't know, I've thought about this a lot. Like, I feel like I'm the generation that's kind of the blank slate, because even though she has no memories of it, it was still so much a part of her life growing up with her parents. Oh, and then you said, what did it feel like to be chosen by Jenna Bush? Wild. It was crazy. This is not my first time at the rodeo, so I know how a book can come out. You can work on a book with your whole heart and soul, and it can come out and just, not get a ton of attention, and just sort of then you just have to, as a writer, you just have to let it go and move on. So this was really so amazing to have her amplify this book and to sort of put it out. Nothing like this has ever happened to me before. There was a moment when she announced it that it was up to number 4 on Amazon, and I knew that wouldn't last for more than a hot second, so I screenshotted that.
Amazing. So as I mentioned to Lauren earlier, this is not Lauren's first trip to TBI.
No.
And that I found out about the book not from Lauren, who I follow and whatever, but from the New York Times, which I read I receive on Sundays and then read throughout the week because it takes me a whole week. And I was just so excited to hear about this story that had these sort of Midwestern roots.
Yeah.
But one of the things I always ask people who write books about the Holocaust is, until when? How much longer are we going to still be seeing stories about the Holocaust? There is a saying in Jewish education that says there's no business like Shoah business.
Yeah.
Shoah being the Hebrew word for Holocaust, that it's just sort of every other Jewish book has some kind of Holocaust theme. What compelled you to write yet another Holocaust book? And what do you think makes your story different from so many that preceded it?
So I don't know if I even think of this book as a Holocaust book. I mean, whatever that is, because I mean, obviously every story is completely unique and special. But I don't know, I feel like this book, it took me, I mean, among other reasons that I put the book aside, one was that I felt like this maybe wasn't a story. Like I felt like there's a genre of Holocaust book, and it's all, you know, it's specific to a certain, you know, horrific experience of maybe people who survived the camps, or I felt like the story of intergenerational trauma, or the story of emigration, and you know, the particular story of my family that thankfully mostly didn't involve, you know, tragic death in the camps, was more about, like I felt like when I was in my 20s, I felt like, well, this isn't really a story worth telling. So it took me a long time to think, well, actually, this is a particular kind of survival. So, yeah, and I mean, I don't know. I know there's a whole huge genre of Holocaust fiction, and I think maybe sometimes there's a sense that like that's so far in the past that it's easier almost to deal with, to confront that, than it is to write stories about the horrors that are happening today, which we all know are continual and continuous.
Yeah, we just did a Holocaust program for the students here at the school, and it was so easy to talk about it in sort of an ironic way, given that what they're watching on the news.
Yeah.
So it was the first time I'd ever had a conversation with young students where they had reference that was so immediate, for better or for worse, and mostly for worse. But it did sensitize them. So you talk a lot in this story. The story is a lot about inherited trauma. Is this something that you experienced in your family? You've made a little bit of reference to that, but how has this inherited trauma impacted the way in which you were raised and the way in which you're raising your girls?
Oh, thank goodness for my husband, or my daughters would be completely bonkers. Yeah, the story is fiction, but it's so closely related to my family's story. And when I was growing up, like I said, I knew there was something, you know, different and unusual about my family, but I didn't have, it was mostly like, it was almost like osmosis, you know, I didn't really have words for it, and I didn't really understand it. So it took me a long time to understand that some of the particular emotional stew that I grew up in was a lot about inherited trauma. And, I mean, this is weird to say, but like the beautiful side of that was that my family is so close and so loving and just so like protective of one another. And like, I talk to my mom, you know, 37 to 39 times a day. You know, I mean, we're really, really tight. And the flip side of that is the sort of like fear and the overprotect. I mean, it's hard for me to even say like the good side and the bad side, because it's all this, you know. And I mean, my inclination that I tamp down constantly is to treat my daughters the same, like, you really shouldn't, like, ride your bike, you know? It's very dangerous. But my husband's from Ireland, and he's like, we had this joke when we were first dating, that his response to everything dangerous was, sure, it's all right. They'll be fine. Like, so we sort of come together in this usually workable common ground where, like, I'm, like, pretty overprotective of the kids, and he's like, why don't you let them walk around the block? So, I mean, they're teenagers now, so I think they're doing okay.
Yeah.
What was your, I'm assuming your mother's read the book?
Yes.
What was her response to reading this and seeing her family? I've said this in other interviews. My parents are so ridiculous that my mom, they'll be like, your hair looks beautiful. Did you wash it? Like, they're so supportive that I knew that, like, whatever, you know, if this book was a pamphlet that I was handing out on the street corner, they'd be like, we are so proud of you. So, I mean, and I think my mom truly recognizes that this is a love letter to our family, you know. So she's been, you know, and I don't think that she could have, I mean, she's not a writer, but even if she were, I don't think that, like I said, I don't think she could have metabolized this story and like written it the same way. So I think she appreciates that too. And I did wash my hair.
Any other questions for people who read it? Barbara?
So, my grandparents came the generation before yours did. And the story my grandmother told were always funny. I mean,
Yeah.
she talked about the first time that she ate a banana in the States, and that kind of thing. And the stories she told from the old country were only funny, and there might have been 2 or 3 of them
Yeah.
at the most. What kind of, did your grandparents say anything about what life was like in Germany?
No, really, no. I mean, I know that, so this story takes place in a bakery. My, the actual story, my grandparents' family owned a butcher shop. And that's how my grandparents met. My grandpa was a cattle dealer, but I am a lifelong vegetarian, so I was like, all right, I'm not setting this story in a butcher shop. They really, like I said, they really didn't talk about it. My dad's family is more like yours. They came from Russia in the 1920s, and they're hilarious. Like, their stories are hilarious. And maybe it's just, like, with, not saying that it was less trauma, but I mean, it was. You know, it was like a slightly less horrific migration, you know, and I feel like they just like weave through humor in a different way. But like my maternal grandparents just really didn't talk about it. I mean, I knew things like, my grandpa said like, I remember these moments so specifically because there were so few of them. Like he said, you know, we bribed the officials. We told them we were going to go through France, and then we went through Turkey instead, and we had to pay them. So, I mean, I know little details like that, but nothing cohesive.
But that's not really, that's not as quite as personal.
Not at all, yeah, exactly.
Yes.
I was curious about that fine line between writing this as a work of fiction and keeping it, you know, as memoir or nonfiction. And I just read your afterword, and you said you didn't have enough material to make it a work of nonfiction. But you could have, for example, maybe written an essay of some sort, or found a way to make it more documentary in approach. So what, I'm just curious, what is it about fiction that allowed you to infuse this with more meaning than memoir or nonfiction?
That's a really good question, thanks. The realization that I could write this as fiction cracked it wide open for me. Like I wrote, my master's thesis was nonfiction. I did write several essays about it, but it felt like almost claustrophobic because I you know, part of my master's thesis is just like pages about meeting and falling in love with someone who wasn't Jewish, which is like relevant, but it didn't feel like the substance of a whole book. I think, you know, having written 3 novels before this, and it took actually my husband saying this and my agent saying this and my own thick skull finally understanding that like fiction would allow me room to breathe. I did a ton of research, which is weird to say was really fun. I mean, because it's a difficult topic to research, obviously, but it was just, the creative process allowed me to write this book in a way that like sticking to memoir just didn't.
So this is a story about 4 women, 4 generations
Yeah.
of women, which is actually one of my favorite kinds of books. I
Oh,
love stories that sort of look at life through the perspective of the women who were the leaders of their family. I mean, this is clearly a story about strong Jewish women. So how did you come to that? There's actually a book, one of my all-time favorite books is a book called Four Mothers, and it's a similar perspective. What brought you to that, and were you trying to elevate the memories of these women? Some you knew, some you didn't.
Yeah, I don't know I feel like it's more for me a question of not what brought me to the story, but like how the story was already a part of me and like how I brought the story out of myself, you know? Like it just seemed, well, first of all, in the first draft of this that was nonfiction, I wasn't a mother yet. I was a daughter, so I knew that side of the story. But I felt like, in retrospect, I have 2 daughters. That's not retrospect, that's just fact. So in retrospect, I had to become a mother, I think, to be able to write this story. And, you know, on the one hand, it's just like, in sort of a processy way, it's just easier for me to imagine women's inner lives than it is for me to imagine men's inner lives. So I sort of took that and ran with it. And I had the letters, and that was clearly, I mean, there was 1 letter from my great-grandfather and 75 letters from my great-grandmother, so that voice was louder and clearer to me. It's not that I was closer with my grandmother, but I just feel like I just understand that chord better, you know?
Interesting.
The way we love each other is so immediate and intense, and, you know, it's just, I should have like a more thoughtful answer to this, but it's just different, you know?
No, I appreciate that.
Yeah.
And I also really appreciate the fact that you couldn't write it until you yourself became a mother. That, you know, life experience so impacts the way in which we understand family stories.
Yes.
I was having a discussion with a group of people the other night in a book group about family secrets, which come up all the time in Holocaust
Yeah.
literature, because so many children of survivors, however you define survivor, know that there were secrets. They just didn't know what they were.
Yeah.
And some went to the graves with the people who held them, and some eventually, I think in part due to our awareness of the Holocaust, our growing awareness,
Yeah.
the Spielberg Project, things that gave survivors platforms to tell stories that they thought no one wanted to hear, which I think for us today is just an amazing concept, that they believed no one wanted to hear these stories, or that they needed to protect.
Yeah.
So what do you hope your own children will get from this book and from this story?
Well, so when the galleys of the book came out, the pre-publication copies, writers get like a little box of them and to distribute as we please. And my daughters ripped them open and like plunked themselves down on the couch and started reading. And my older daughter, who's 19 now, just burst into tears. And my younger daughter and I were like, what's going on? And she said, you mean Grandma never saw her grandma again? Like, she knew this story. She, you know, because we do talk about it. And my younger daughter and I were both like, right. But I think that reading the story was a moment of connection for her, and she sort of internalized it and owned it in a way that she never had before. And she, you know, so she cried for a while, and then she called my mom and was like, and I could hear my mom on the other end of the phone saying, like, you know, we just sort of help her, like, talk her through this. But I'm too jaded to hope my kids really get anything specific that I'm trying to teach them. But I hope that they understand that they make the connection with their own history and so internalize it that they become people who won't stand for it when it happens in the world. That's a huge hope, but that is what I hope.
And do you think it helps them understand you differently?
I mean, I'm an open book with them, so.
Great. Is this it for this genre? Are you done writing about this topic? Or
I'm
is there
so done. I'm so done. I don't know. I mean, I think so. I think like I thought I was done 25 years ago. And we moved to Milwaukee and I started writing my first novel, Still Life with Husband, which was about like betrayal and heartbreak. And I was like, this is going to be light. And then, but in the Days of Awe, which was about grief and death, but still so much more fun. And then, when I came back to this book, it was, I guess I want to say cathartic in a way to write this. And I do feel like, who knows, because you don't really know your own sort of trajectory as a writer, but I do feel like I'm done with this topic. It was hard.
It's got to be.
Yeah.
You've got to feel like you leave everything on the table.
Absolutely.
So you grew up in Milwaukee, though,
Yes.
right? So one of the things that struck me as somebody whose family also comes from Milwaukee,
Right.
Milwaukee was the home of the Bund. It was a pretty anti-Semitic German community,
Yeah.
but yet a lot of Germans settled there because there were German grocery stores and German
Yeah.
clubs, and the settlement cookbook came out of the German community of Milwaukee, which was at one time the cookbook that every Jewish bride got when she got married. It was obligatory.
Yeah.
So it sort of it always fascinated me, and I remember having these conversations with my mother and my grandparents about why Milwaukee became sort of this place that so many, we're sitting in Skokie, which had the largest population of survivors, but Milwaukee was up there.
Yeah.
It had a huge population of survivors.
Yeah.
Do you think growing up in that community impacted you in a particular way, impacted your parents? Was there a reason they chose to settle there? And how did that play itself out?
I mean, I'm from a suburb of Milwaukee where, half of my friends were Jewish growing up. Although I had a boyfriend in college who was from a different suburb who showed me like the manifest, like of the original like organizing document of his suburb that said no blacks or Jews. So I mean, it was I mean, I know it affected my mom. She has some stories. She grew up in Milwaukee and has stories about like people yelling. Like she told me once that she was running across someone's lawn when she was really little, and the owner yelled, "Get off my lawn, you dirty Jew!" Like stuff like that. But I mean. I'm already minimizing it, but whatever. But that's I don't know if that would have happened anywhere. Milwaukee was a very German community, which I think afforded refugees some immense comfort. I mean, who could process what had happened to them? I mean, we still can't process it all these years later. So there was probably just a level of like appealing familiarity, and the landscape is really similar to Germany, the rolling hills and. My grandpa was a cattle dealer in Germany and continued to be one in Wisconsin. He spoke with the German farmers and traded, dealt with the German farmers in German. So I mean, I think there's a comfort level there. But I mean, I didn't experience anything growing up other than your just sort of typical Jewish suburban childhood. Yeah. But also, my grandpa was from a large farming family in Germany, and some of his siblings were in Milwaukee. So, I mean, I think that's how immigrant communities function in the States. You go where your relatives are. So he had a couple of siblings already in Milwaukee.
Yes.
I'm fascinated by the fact that the letters were part of a master's thesis many years ago.
Yes.
So,
The bad one.
did any sentences or paragraphs or sections get lifted from the master's thesis into the novel? And relatedly, I'm just curious about the imaginative process. When you first realized you could make it a work of fiction, I mean, did you do that pretty quickly, or has this all been germinating for decades?
Yes. Yes to all of that. Excuse me. When my agent asked me 6 years ago if she could see my master's thesis, because she's like, maybe there's something there. And I took 200 pages and was so it was such a cringe moment for me. I guess maybe a lot of writers feel that way about their previous work, but I was like, I can't. So I winnowed it down to 7 pages and sent her those 7 pages. And nothing of that appeared in the book. But the original draft of the fictionalized version of the story did not include the contemporary thread. There's historical fiction in the novel, and then there's the thread about a young woman in Milwaukee in the 90s trying to sort of pry herself away from her history. And that was sort of not a direct lift from the memoir, but like a sort of conceptual translation. Was there a second part of your question that's went out of my head?
It was about just how long did it take you to imagine, to take these real characters and imagine them as fictional characters? Has that been something with you for many, many years, or did you kind of do it all in a very short, compressed period?
It felt pretty compressed to me. It was a couple of years. It definitely wasn't in my thoughts during the time I was writing it as a memoir or conceiving it as a memoir, because I think, I thought, we live in a world where there are Holocaust deniers. I have to write this as the truth. So it took me, when I had that shift and was able to think, okay, this can still be truthful and be historical fiction, then that was a really, that was a burst of light for me. That was a sort of remarkable, intellectual moment for me, but I hadn't thought of it that way in all the time that this project was a part of me. One of the details I knew about my family was that my great-grandmother, whose name was Frida, was really hard on my grandma, and my grandma was she was 4'11" and just really soft and warm, and so all through my childhood I thought who could have been hard on her? So that was one of the pieces of information I had about my family that I was able to expand and fictionalize and turn into these 2 characters.
Not really, I can't seem to form a question here, but I want to say that I really appreciate Laura talked about how this book is about generations of mothers and daughters eloquently you wrote about kind of being a mother and being a daughter at the same time, and trying, it's hard, right? And
Yeah.
especially not having your mother with you during, a large portion of that.
Yeah.
So, it was a very nicely, part of that book.
Thank you. I thought a lot about that because my mom is still and was such a huge part of my early motherhood. Just like her voice in my head telling me sort of what to do and how to be, and just her physical presence, like, Mom, I need to work, here are the babies, and I couldn't imagine, I could imagine, but it was difficult to think about the experience of, especially the intensity of young, early motherhood, and not having my own mother with me to sort of guide me along that path. So that was part of that's something I felt deeply and was able to kind of incorporate into the book.
When you spent that year translating the letters,
Mhm.
I'm just imagining that there were some difficult moments.
Yeah.
That it seems like, was it difficult for you to keep going back week after week and unearthing that trauma, or was it not a trauma to you?
No, I loved going back and spending that hour with this German professor, but I was really sad that year. It was really like, it was a part of me, it was sort of in my bones that year. I remember thinking, like, sometimes I'd go back to I lived alone, and sometimes I would go back to my apartment building and just have this moment of thinking that I would open the mailbox and there'd be a letter from my great-grandmother. Like, it was so intrinsic to who I was, especially that year. It was so sad, just to read her despair and to know that she didn't make it out.
And that it wasn't just that hour, because then you transcribed it. So
Yeah.
Yeah.
I know, the transcription process was, I think a lot about this, like, so old school. I don't think, like, if I just stumbled on these letters today, I would just send them off somewhere and get them back, But, like, the process of, like, it went through me.
I think that was critical.
Yeah.
Actually, critical for you, critical for the way the story was
I
told.
think so too.
Your ability, we often call these kinds of books split screen novels that are taken and, written in all these different time periods. But you had this kaleidoscope of these four women
Yeah.
that you lifted up, who you clearly embody.
Yeah, I felt like that.
And I also think that I knew my great-grandparents, and I have, Rachel and I have a couple of friends who are the children of survivors, and one of the things, we had a book event at my house, and I have all these family pictures, and one of the women said to me, I don't have any of that. I don't have pictures of my great aunts and uncles. I don't have pictures of even my great grandparents. Maybe one picture remained. And it helped me appreciate what I had, and also I think have a deeper understanding of folks like you whose families lost so much, and that we, particularly as women, I think hold this notion that we are the keepers of family history.
Yeah.
And when we don't have, especially for a generation that is so committed to visuals, that they don't have the visuals,
Yeah.
they don't have that picture of those people in their lives. What you did through this book for your own girls and for your, God willing, grandchildren someday, is you've given them shape. And I think that that is an amazing gift.
Thank you.
That a writer has, and that you have in particular, that you have done for your family. And that I think there was a time when I was kind of cavalier about all these memoirs that were coming out. And, not everyone's story is interesting,
Right.
but everyone thinks their story is interesting.
True.
And, and I love memoir. I love reading memoir. And I have a newfound appreciation for books that are able to put meat on the bones for the next generation, because identity is so importantly formed by knowing where we came from and
Yeah.
who we came from. And in this book, I think you just did a remarkable job of building out these women
Thank you.
in a way that gives your daughters, and as I said, your future grandchildren, a sense of where they came from. I think that's just so important today.
Thank you.
Cindy.
As you're talking, I'm just thinking back at what a gift these letters were, even though obviously it's difficult family history. Today, there would be maybe emails,
Right.
maybe, and they wouldn't be printed, they wouldn't
Yeah, I agree. Although I do have like 10,000 emails in my inbox, so maybe, no, I know exactly what you mean. Like there's the physicality of letters is irreplaceable.
Even when you talked about onion skin.
Yeah,
Right?
just
We-
like, I can still smell it.
Right, we can imagine what that is because we used to write on onion skin, especially those of us who lived abroad.
Right.
That was how we
Yeah.
communicated with our families. Like, this generation doesn't know what an aerogram is, they don't
Yeah.
know what,
Or how you had to fold them like,
right, those little red, white, and blue
Yeah.
stripes on the envelope.
Right.
The par avion, right? Like, none of that will exist for them. I think Cindy's
Yeah.
absolutely right.
yeah,
When I unpacked my family house, I found letters and things that I did not know about my family, that my grandfather actually changed his name. There were all these legends about Ellis Island, which turned out to be total nonsense, that most people's names were not changed at Ellis Island, but most Jewish people changed their names because of anti-Semitism. And I actually found the letter that proved that in my own family, that it was not at Ellis Island as I'd been told, but it actually been intentional, that my grandfather had changed his name because he wanted to get into dental school and he didn't think he
Yeah.
would get into Marquette actually.
oh, he wouldn't have.
So that firsthand documentation is really lost to this generation, and so bringing these letters. There's a book by Ferris Cassell. I don't know if you've heard of her. She is a non-Jewish journalist who husband was a doctor, Jewish, and had a patient who was dying, and it's an amazing story. And this patient gave the doctor, because he was the only Jew she knew, living in this small town in Northern California, gave these letters that she had from her family who were trying to get out of Austria.
Oh, wow.
And then this journalist, for 10 years, researched the family, ended up finding a bunch of the family. It's an amazing story. And it's kind of, for me, what lifted up the importance of being able to take this firsthand documentation and put the meat on the bones,
Yeah.
recreate these stories, and tell them in ways that are palatable. And memoir is not always palatable. Some
Yeah.
of those Warsaw Ghetto, Lodz Ghetto stories are really, really hard to read, and we know that a lot of people just, for whatever personal reasons, can't do that. But by writing a book like this, you give access to a story that people need to know, need to be able to share. And of course, the women empowerment thing and all of that was great, but you made it readable and accessible. Even, this is clearly an adult novel, but I recommended it to a couple of our high school kids who were looking, with the Advent of Yom HaShoah, to read some other stuff that's not the Diary of Anne Frank. And I think this is just that kind of book. So thank you for writing it.
Thank you. Well, I was going to say, while you were talking about the physical nature of the letters and how that puts meat on the bones of the stories, another thing that having the letters as objects did for me as a writer was allow me, in a way that I don't think that could have been replicated if they were in another format, it allowed me to have a conversation with the letters. So some of the stories in the book stem directly from statements that my great-grandmother made about, she'd be like, "You're so careless if you forgot your coat. If I don't remember everything, no one does." So I was able to converse with that in a way that I don't think I would have been able to, if
Hearing a story.
or just if they were, yeah, exactly, if it was just a story that I heard, or if it was some other format, I was able to take that moment from the letters and turn it almost into turn it into a scene in the book, almost like a call and response with her.
Exactly, and you captured her personality, that I'm not sure you could have done just hearing a
Yeah,
couple of
no,
family stories.
definitely not.
You actually saw her handwriting.
Yeah.
I think handwriting, again, something we don't spend a lot of time thinking about today.
Right.
But I was showing, in the same book group this week, was showing a cookbook that my mother made me when I got married, that's all written out in her handwriting. She has very beautiful handwriting. I mean, mine never came close to that. But so much of how I think of her and her elegance was tied into her handwriting. So I think you were able to take that also elegance of your great-grandmother and translate that into this story.
Right, it's her voice in a way that nothing else really is.
Exactly. Yes.
Speaking of the handwriting, I've just been looking at
Yeah, I know.
To you, I mean, I'm sorry your publisher couldn't find a way to put it on the cover. I mean, they're astonishing.
I know.
The handwriting, could you describe like the paper that they're written on, or do you think your great grandmother intended that these would be kept for forever? Or?
I don't think so. Like I have no idea really what she was thinking. But like I said before, she wasn't a writer and she wasn't a storyteller. I think she was just like, get me out of here, And yeah, I mean, when I first saw them, to me they just looked like knife marks on a page. Like they're really, it's like nothing I'd ever seen before. It was like not the Roman alphabet, but yeah, they are astonishing. And the fact that they're like, the paper that they're written on is sort of like crumbling around the edges. And there's some censorship in them too. There's some like words crossed out. So that's why I think she didn't talk about politics at all. I think that she knew she wasn't allowed to do that. So that it's like a lot of, the letters are very mundane in a way. They're like, should I sell my pots and pans? You didn't answer me. Should I sell my pots and pans? What about the piano? Like there's a lot of mundane day-to-day stuff, partly because they were censored.
Lauren, what are you working on next?
Well, I never tell.
You hinted about this book the last time.
Did I?
Yes.
Well, okay, fine. No, I'm writing a contemporary retelling of the myth of Persephone.
Oh, wow.
I hope I am. I don't know. Probably just ruined it, so.
That seems to be a very popular genre right now.
Greek.
People retelling, particularly from female characters in mythology. I've read a couple of books like that, which frankly for me really elevated my understanding of the stories.
Mhm.
We have that tradition within Jewish life also of Midrash being rewritten in modern perspective. I think the first book we ever did here as book club was The Red Tent, which is probably the
That's
standard,
the OG.
standard bearer for
Yeah.
the retelling of a particular character's story.
But this will be contemporary. This won't
So,
be. So,
so
yeah.
you're going to tell the story in a contemporary manner. What do you hope to accomplish with that?
I guess fame and fortune. I don't know how to answer that question other than flippantly because it's so it's kind of fetal right now. So, I mean, I just felt like, I guess one thing I'm thinking about as I'm working on it is that we can't, as a writer, I can't, and I don't think anyone can, get away from what's going on in the world, both in terms of COVID and in terms of the sort of the environmental, the impending crisis and just everything seems and is so much worse now even than it was when I was writing this book a few years ago. So I feel like maybe if this is a successful project, maybe there'll be some way for me to filter some of that into the story and back out. Because it's really, I feel like I read one book about the pandemic by Gary Steingart. It was called Our Country Friends. And I feel like it was a pretty successful story about the pandemic, but it ended kind of abruptly. And obviously it had to because he didn't have the foresight to know how long this would last. But I feel like that stuff, it's really, really hard to write about what's going on right now. And it's so vivid and awful that I feel like maybe my task as I'm writing this book is to somehow figure out how to translate it into fiction. That is lofty and I will probably fail.
No, I doubt it. And I think that is exactly the role of writers in our society. We just had a conversation about whether people are ready to read pandemic books.
Yeah.
And I always harken back to Elie Wiesel, who I heard speak about Night a number of years ago. And he said Night had to be published when it was published because 10 years earlier no one was ready for it.
Yeah.
Nobody could read about the experience they had just been through.
It was too immediate.
And it has lived on,
Yeah.
which is something else I think about with literature. Are the books being written today going to have the kind of longevity that so many of the books that we read when we were in school
Yeah.
have had? And do you as a writer think about that? Are you writing something for the long haul or for the Jenna's Book Club? Is it, not that can't contribute to a long haul book,
Right,
but
right.
is that something that do you want your books to live on, or are they for the moment?
I mean, I don't know. I don't know. That's such a, I can almost not admit. Of course I want them to live on, but who knows? I mean, I guess maybe the real answer is I only have control over myself in my chair, you know, trying not to knock over the stacks of paper that are surrounding me and just focusing on the work. And, you know, it really doesn't do me any good to think about the future of my work. Because then that's kind of paralyzing. So the only thing that I can really do is just try to, you know, discipline myself to sit down at my computer every day and write what is meaningful and like what feels the like juiciest and most important to me. So beyond that, it's not in my hands.
Great. Barbara?
Where are those letters now?
I have them at home.
They're in a special, they're still in that box?
No,
Back?
no, I don't know what happened to the box, but I have the letters.
And what is your hope for them?
People have asked me that over the course of this past year since the book came out, and I never know how to answer it. I mean, I guess I'm just going to keep them. I mean, some people have said, "Are you going to donate them somewhere?" And I don't know if I should, or if they should, you know, if I should give them back to my mom, or if they should go to my kids. But right now, they're just in my hands.
I wonder what the world of, where there's so much firsthand documentation
Yeah.
that people are wondering about. I mean, we get it sometimes here. People are just looking to dump things.
Yeah, I don't
when
wanna
they're
do that.
Cleaning out a grandparent's house,
Yeah.
and we've ended up with things that we actually have ended up donating to the Holocaust Museum because we just felt that the synagogue was not the right place to hold
Right.
them, and that we wanted researchers
Yeah.
to have access to them. But like everyone has to make that
Yeah.
decision.
It's hard to know what to do with them.
It's hard to know.
Because I know how special they are to me and to my family, but I don't know if that's something that would, you know, I don't know if they would be meaningful as part of a larger project. I don't know.
Yes.
So I'm Kenosha native, and not too many Jewish-themed books come out of southeastern Wisconsin. What has been the reception or the experience that you've had in terms of, you know, being in Milwaukee and seeing how the book has resonated?
It's funny because in a way with this book, it hasn't been this way with the other books, but because of the pandemic, so much has been virtual that this book hasn't felt local to me in a way. I have done a bunch of book clubs, and some of them have been, you know, they've been all over the country, and some of them have been in Milwaukee. But in a way, it just feels like the reception of this book has been kind of a little bit more like I mean, I'm delighted and feel very lucky about this, but it's been a little bit more national.
As another Southern Wisconsin native, I agree.
Yeah.
And I think that it's fascinating that these stories, I mean, the story that I mentioned earlier from the small hole in Northern California, that, you know, not everyone went to New York,
Yeah.
Chicago, and LA, or Odessa, and that there were these pockets of survivors who ended up all over the
Sure.
country, each with their, you know, from Blytheville, Arkansas to, you know, somewhere in South Dakota, because they had someone who could sponsor them.
Right. Exactly. Exactly.
And I mean, we're seeing that play out now again,
Right.
right? We were just told that the government will allow Ukrainians to come in if they have a sponsor. And now does not have to be a familial relationship as it did then.
Yep.
And so it'll be fascinating to see how this next generation of survivors settle and change the communities in which they were in, because I think there's no doubt that the survivors who settled in Milwaukee and the surrounding areas changed their communities.
Yeah.
And impacted them in pretty significant ways.
Yeah. When I was living in Minneapolis in my 20s, the Hmong community was just growing, like, and is now such an integral part of the city. Like, I think that's one of the best. Obviously, that's just one of the best things about this country, that communities rise up where there are a couple of family members, and this becomes so important to their cities.
I have a friend who says that 20 years of civil war in Lebanon did a lot for the American palate.
Seriously.
Because all of these Lebanese brought Middle Eastern food. I mean, there was no such thing as going to a restaurant and eating falafel or sushi when I was growing up,
Yeah,
right? And
right.
Fuyang was about as ethnic as it got. And it really is, I think, one of the blessings of this country, and your family is part of that story. Thank you so much for being
Well,
here
my
with us
pleasure.
today. And please go to the back. And buy books. I think they brought like an array of your books.
Yeah.
So if you haven't read Send For Me, absolutely get it. But also, Lauren's other books are absolutely worth the read. We've read some of them here back in the day. So thank you
Thank
again
you.
for coming
Thank you so
back.
much. It was my pleasure.
I'll go
Thank you to
sign
the
it.
streamers.